Okay, so the key concept we want to explore is this idea of genocide. Um, and we need to think about where did this word come from? What does it mean? How does it get used? And it really has a relatively short history. It didn't really exist before the Second World War. And it was initially developed by a Polish Jewish legal scholar, Raphael Lemkin. And obviously, the context there is the Holocaust, which affected him obviously directly, being in Europe at the time, and also the events of the Second World War, the violence of the Nazis, the incredible destructiveness and cruelty of the Holocaust really sort of set the scene for there being a need to talk about what had happened, to categorize it correctly, to understand it correctly, and to see if it could be in some ways prevented in the future. And Raphael Lemkin himself was very cautious to ensure that the notion of genocide shouldn't be used just to talk about the Holocaust. He wanted a broad concept that could be used to describe other similar situations. And in fact, he started developing it before the Holocaust really took place. Even the English word genocide doesn't exist until the combination of these two elements, geno and side, are put together by Lemkin to talk about this idea of a kind of the destruction of a people. This was then immediately after the Second World War, with the establishment of the United Nations and their move to try and formalize international law, human rights, laws of war, to prevent a catastrophic situation like the First and Second World Wars happening again. So in 1948, the United Nations formalized this document, which is still the kind of key document in the field, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. But aside from that document, which is really a document for providing a legal framework for identifying genocide and taking action against it, the concept of genocide continues not only as that legal concept, but as a concept in social analysis. And that it continues to be an evolving concept. And in fact, there's an entire field, a social science research field of genocide studies that continues to be an active and developing area of the social sciences. The first thing we notice is that there are contested meanings of genocide, that there are different ideas in popular culture, in law, and in the social sciences. And certainly, if you ask friends or family who are not specialists in those fields what genocide is, they would give you a different idea to what international legal scholars would give you, to what some social scientists may give you. But the important thing is that the notion of genocide does certain kinds of work. The first thing it does is it identifies the seriousness of a particular set of events or processes, and it performs a very significant function in doing that. Within that, it identifies perpetrators and victims, and here we see the kind of politics of the notion of trauma already being present, because there are two different interests here. Victims want their suffering to be recognized. Perpetrators want their violence to be concealed. So there's already a contestation between perpetrators and victims around the recognition and the application of the term genocide. Because the term immediately does certain things. It challenges social and moral legitimacy. To call something a genocide immediately places it in a category where it cannot be seen as justified anymore. It places it as something that is reprehensible, that's something that should be stopped, something that cannot be justified. But it also, in a kind of formal legal way, it enables certain responses. It triggers certain obligations and certain responses. And precisely because of this, it is highly contested. And we certainly see, in retrospect, we see this kind of Holocaust denialism occurring, but we see in more or less every genocide the perpetrators denying that what is taking place is a genocide, and the victims arguing that it should be recognized as such. And we see this right back before the Second World War, before the Holocaust. We see this, the Armenian genocide. To this day, the government of Turkey absolutely does not recognize their role in the Armenian genocide, and in fact criminalizes identifying the Armenian genocide. And the same thing happened in Bosnia, and has happened subsequently. Now, within the process of recognition, one of the formal places in which genocide can be recognized is in the International Court of Justice. Okay, so the International Court of Justice can hear cases of genocide, and then uses as its primary kind of legal template this UN Declaration on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and it can refer cases, findings about genocide to the United Nations Security Council, and the United Nations Security Council can then take certain kinds of action. We saw, for instance, in the case of Bosnia, that there was a kind of a military response. But that's not the only possible kind of responses. But certainly it enables an international, formal, legal, and potentially military response. Of course, there's fundamental problems in the UN Security Council, linking to something which is really a matter for another day, which is the fact that certain countries have the power to veto any decisions, any actions made by the Security Council. So single countries can sabotage attempts to do something about genocides, and this has happened. In fact, this is currently happening. Okay, the other thing we need to say is that even though the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, can make findings of genocide as a kind of empowered international legal body, there's no necessity that something has to be found to be genocide in illegal proceedings of the ICJ for us to use the word genocide to describe it. As social scientists, as concerned people, we can certainly use the analytic and descriptive term of genocide outside its function as a legal category. And in fact, there's good reasons to argue that we very much should do that. So then let's look at this 1948 UN Declaration on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And this is it's a downloadable document, very easy to access. And what you should be doing now is actually looking, and particularly the real interesting stuff there is it's a relatively lengthy document, but the stuff you need to think about and be familiar with is in Articles 2 and 3, which are very short. It's a single page. So Article 2 says, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as, okay, so that's the kind of the opening definition, and then it gives, in the such as, it gives 5 different categories: killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So let's break down those elements so that we understand them very clearly. So the first is, in the prologue, intention to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Okay, so the first word there is the word intent. There has to be an intention. It must be a deliberate act, which means that you can have genocidal acts which are not categorized as genocide because they were not done with the intention of destroying a group in whole or in part. Okay, and this is one of the legal problems with genocide. It's often easy to show that genocidal acts have happened, that they've had genocidal effects, but it's harder to show that the perpetrators intended that outcome. Of course, it's much easier when the perpetrators publicly admit, as we've seen in recent cases, that is their goal. Now, the important thing to notice there is intent to destroy, and here is the crunch: in whole or in part. Okay, and this is important. It does not imply the plan to annihilate an entire group, to completely destroy every member of a particular group. It can also be destroying in part, but and that's really important, because part of the sort of common sense notion of genocide that most people use is that, oh, it must be about killing every single person in a group, and then they say, yes, but that's not genocide because everyone wasn't killed. This is nonsense. This doesn't apply analytically as in social science or under law. Okay, but there must be an attempt to destroy the members of the group because they are members of the group. It can't just be like, oh, a bunch of people who happened to be in that group were harmed. They are being intentionally harmed because they fall into that category. Now, unfortunately, I think the definition is a little bit weak, because in defining groups, it says a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So there's 4 different kinds of groups: a country, an ethnicity, a race, a religion. What if it's a different kind of group? There are many kinds of groups other than those 4 categories. And in the Holocaust, there are many kinds of groups that are in those categories. The Nazis tried to destroy, firstly, political groups: communists, anarchists, trade unionists. That was a very important early part of the genocide that the Nazis implemented, was the genocide of their political opponents. They also, right at the beginning, before things escalated, were trying to kill people with disabilities. That was the first part of the project, was killing people with physical and mental disabilities that they did not feel should be part of their master race. They also were killing gay and trans people. Now, none of these groups are protected under that definition. People with disabilities, I mean, that's very serious, kind of eugenics genocide, but it's not mentioned there. A group that is defined in terms of gender, sex, sexual orientation, that is not accommodated there. And most interestingly, political groups are not accommodated there, and that is very specifically because some of the participants in the United Nations wanted it excluded. Some countries deliberately didn't want political groups included, because then they could be brought to account for the destruction of political minorities and opponents within their countries. So that limitation is unfortunate there, but also it doesn't mean we stuck with that. That's precisely why this is a evolving concept, evolving definition that can be transformed and expanded to new circumstances. Okay, then let's look at the 5 different kinds of action that are included in the definition. First, killing members of the group. And this is the popular understanding of genocide: kill everyone in that group. But it's too limited, as we pointed out before. It doesn't mean even attempting to kill all members of a group. It simply specifies attempting to destroy a group in whole or in part. Okay. But killing, once again, is only one possible part of it. And the important thing to realize is that these these five types of action, they don't have to all be present for it to be genocide. Any combination of them can be present. So killing is not the overriding factor, but destroying the group in whole or in part is fundamental to the definition. Okay. Then we move from killing members of a group and to this really much more interesting category, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Now now we've moved very far away from killing them. Okay, so causing serious, A, bodily, B, mental harm to members of the group. Bodily harm, that could be deliberately injuring them. It could be expose them to disease. It could be exposing them to the elements, the snow, the heat. It could be creating conditions of starvation or dehydration, or disease, like any of those kind of physical harms that are deliberately, intentionally brought to bear on members or all of a group. Secondly, we have the category of mental harm. This would probably think more today of as psychological trauma, that psychologically traumatizing a group is an element of the crime of genocide. So creating terror, creating a fear of death or injury, which in psychological terms are an important part of the definition of trauma, but also creating kind of humiliation, denigration, psychological damage, creating emotional conditions that destroy the well-being of the group. This is a really important element. So we can think of examples. It could be beating people, it could be bombing people, it could be the kind of treatment that was involved with slavery, it could be shooting, it could be simply making the entire environment unsafe. It could be kind of at a different level of destroying language and cultural practices so that the group cannot anymore function as a group because those cultural and linguistic resources are destroyed. It could be social isolation. It could be destroying autonomy or making people helpless. It could be making everyday life so unpredictable, so difficult, or so dangerous that it is impossible to sustain mental well-being under those conditions. So there's a lot going on there, but pay much closer attention to the notion of causing serious bodily or mental harm to the notion of killing. Because this really goes beyond what people often imagine when they're thinking of genocide. Third, okay, and this is also very interesting, inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So here the thing is conditions of life. So you're creating the conditions to destroy the group. That doesn't mean, the shooting, the bombing. It means creating conditions and people don't have the stuff they need. So things like deliberately creating conditions where someone doesn't have food, where someone doesn't have water, where someone doesn't have physical shelter that they need to survive, clothing, the buildings, and certainly the way they don't have the health care they need to survive. All of these would contribute to bringing about the physical destruction of a group in whole or in part. So this could be, removing sources of food and water, like damaging agricultural land, poisoning the water wells, damaging water purification systems and water supply systems. It could be destroying homes and other forms of shelter. It could be preventing the distribution of essential resources, so essential resources like medicines, like food, all the things people need to live. It could certainly be in the form of destroying hospitals, clinics, healthcare resources, killing doctors, nurses, and paramedics. All of those are things that are essential conditions of life necessary to survive. And if those are withheld or if those are destroyed, this certainly constitutes genocide. And the fourth and fifth categories we can group together because this is about children, okay? So the fourth category is imposing measures intended to prevent the births of children within the group, or forcibly transferring the children from the group to another group. So this is about preventing the group literally reproducing itself, like literally having children, those children being raised, having children in turn, so that the group can carry on existing through time. And certainly we see things like the transfer of children from the group. That was a huge part of colonization of Australia. But we also have often seen imposing measures intended to prevent births. Here we can think of forced sterilization or involuntary sterilization, where people were sterilized without being told that it was happening. We can see the destruction of all the resources required for reproductive health. Bombing of hospitals, killing of doctors, those kinds of things, or imposing conditions that don't allow mothers to bring their children to birth and to raise them in a way that they are healthy and survive. So the first thing, and this is one of the terrible things about famine, like with imposition of famine, withholding food, means that mothers can't produce milk, that their children can't feed, and so they die. Not having clean water. Babies are very, very susceptible to waterborne diseases from impure water, dysentery, things like that. So simply withholding clean water and adequate food is a genocide against a group by removing by creating measures that actually prevent children growing up in a healthy way. Another terrible thing that isn't mentioned here, but we now know is very common in genocides, is the deliberate rape of women by the genocidal group, so that the children they have are children of the genocidal group, not of the victim group. And we've seen this repeatedly happening, and the kind of terrible psychological problems that follow from not only the sexual assault, but the complexity of raising children who are in one sense a physical embodiment of the genocidal aggressors. So all of these are elements, and it's not like they all need to be happening. Any combination of them can be happening for us to understand it as genocide. So we get to the question of, well, then when is genocide justified? And the answer is very simple. It can never be justified. But it's worth saying out loud, so conditions under which it is not justified. Firstly, there is no provision under any circumstances for genocide to be used as a strategy for political domination or control. Further, there's absolutely no provision under any circumstances for genocide to be used as a strategy for gaining land, gaining access to resources, or gaining access to wealth. Further, we need to specify that there's absolutely no provision whatsoever under any circumstances for genocide to be used as a punishment. And it doesn't matter what the punishment is for. There's no act for which genocide is a justifiable punishment. Finally, that genocide can never be a justifiable strategy for achieving safety or security. And the reason for pointing these out is because we are seeing at the moment precisely these arguments being made, that genocide is necessary as a punishment, as a deterrent, as a means of establishing safety and security. And it has historically been used over and over again. It's historically been a core practice of colonialism. in driving people off land, stealing that land, stealing the natural resources, and creating wealth at other people's expense. And we've seen it as a form of political control, of getting rid of political opposition and seizing a kind of totalitarian political control. So let's be clear. Any attempt to justify genocide under any circumstances is absolutely wrong. Okay, so there's our definition of genocide. Now, further, we can look at one particular controversial, contested example that is happening at the moment, and this is the specific example of the case of that was brought to the International Court of Justice in December 2023, and this is the case brought by South Africa against Israel for the crime of genocide in the Gaza Strip. So this case was brought. Many countries have joined South Africa in supporting that case, and one country has joined Israel in defending against that case, and that lone additional defender is, of course, the country of Germany. Okay, now, because cases like this are very long and complex, they can really go on for many years, and this one already has. What the court did is very soon, several weeks after the case was brought, they handed down provisional measures because of the dire urgency and seriousness of the situation. So these provisional measures are intermediate measures which say we haven't had time to fully examine all the evidence, to consider all the legal arguments in order to come to a conclusion on this matter, but something has to be done right now to prevent further genocidal acts happening, to prevent the process of genocide escalating. So based on the already existing evidence, they made a set of they handed down a set of provisions of things that were required to be done immediately. And here I'm going to read and explain the various provisions. Okay, so this was handed down in January of 2024. The State of Israel shall, in accordance with its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, in relation to the Palestinians in Gaza, and here we go, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention. And Article 2 was exactly what we've just been discussing. Okay, it's the harm to the mental and physical health. It's the destruction of the conditions of life. All of those things are Article 2 of the Convention. So this requires Israel to immediately do everything in its power to prevent any of those offenses being committed. In particular, and they specify them again, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So that's once again, it's simply restating Article 2 of the Convention and saying and requiring that Israel immediately prevent any of those things happening. It then further specifies another 4 points. The State of Israel shall ensure with immediate effect that its military does not commit any acts described in point 1 above. So this is particularly that the state shall rein in the military, shall instruct the military, shall put limits on the military that they do not do anything that falls under the elements of the crime of genocide. Okay. Next, the State of Israel shall take all measures within its power to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to genocide in relation to members of the Palestine group in the Gaza Strip. So this is basically saying the state is required to stop people inciting genocide, stop politicians saying like, oh, we must destroy these people, stop members of the public, talk show hosts, performing musicians, random people on the street, talking in a way that incites and justifies genocide. Okay. The next point is the State of Israel shall take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Okay, so to take immediate action to actively to ensure the provision of services and assistance. So obviously there, food, water, medical services, all of those things, those must be enabled. Not just that they mustn't prevent them, they must actively enable them. They must ensure that those are provided. Okay? And finally, the State of Israel shall take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to the allegations within the scope of Article 2 and Article 3. And this is simply saying this is an ongoing case, so you may not destroy the evidence that we need to come to a conclusion on this case. Now, looking at these 5 provisions, we can see why these were proposed. We can see how they reflect the underlying categories in the convention. But the very, very striking thing that happened, that we can also see, given that these were handed down in January of 2024, that not only has not one single one of these provisions been met, but they have the exact opposite has been actively done. Everything stated in the provisions has been openly defied, and the exact opposite has been done. So in this sense, that these specific things, killing members of the group have been killed every day since then. Causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group, that once again, that has been done on a daily basis, unrelentingly, and escalated rather than de-escalate. Okay, inflicting on the group conditions of life to bring about its physical destruction in whole and part. This has been proceeding and escalating. The complete destruction of all homes, the destruction of hospitals, the destruction of all the things, the deliberate bombing of water supply, the deliberate poisoning of water wells, the deliberate assassination of water engineers, the bombing of hospitals, the deliberate and systematic murder of healthcare workers, of paramedics, of nurses, of doctors, the deliberate assassination of doctors, the deliberate abduction and torture to death of doctors. These have all proceeded with absolutely no abatement. And so the conditions of life have been very actively destroyed, but perhaps most actively in the deliberate withholding of food, in the blockading of food, and the creation of conditions of mass famine. Now that's interesting because that relates to the 4th point there, imposing measures intended to prevent births. Now, not only have reproductive health clinics been bombed and destroyed, not only have doctors, all the maternal facilities, the medical facilities of birth being destroyed, but the withholding of food and the creation of famine prevents children surviving. Infants are most susceptible to malnutrition and famine and disease. So withholding health, water, and food from them massively impacts on their survival. So there's clearly been a strategic intervention to prevent babies surviving under these conditions. Secondly, ensuring that the military do not commit those acts. Well, the military have been ordered to commit those acts. The military have been observed committing those acts. The military have been congratulated for committing those acts. So an open defiance of that. Secondly, taking all measures to prevent and punish the direct public incitement. the exact opposite has happened. We have seen Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, Danila Weiss, Netanyahu himself inciting genocide, and in the case of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, repeatedly on a weekly basis. We've also seen people from every level of society, from entertainers to people in the media, to the soldiers, publicly and openly inciting genocide to the point of it being completely normalized. So there's been an open defiance of that provision. The second last one, immediate and effective measures to urgently provide basic needed service and humanitarian assistance. Once again, not only has that not been done, the opposite has very actively and deliberately been done. There's been a deliberate destruction of hospitals, water resources, agricultural resources. There's been a very deliberate bombing of hospitals, killing of medical workers. There's been a very deliberate blockading of food and medicines to the kind of preposterous point where international medical volunteers are searched to see if they are carrying baby formula, infant formula, into the area to stop kids dying, and that is removed from them if they attempt to do that. So once again, not only have the measures not been implemented, they have been defied, and the opposite has been openly, deliberately, and consistently done. The question of destruction of evidence, who knows? Perhaps they haven't cared enough as to whether that evidence exists or is destroyed. Perhaps it's been very systematically being destroyed. But certainly there's now so much evidence that you can't destroy it anymore. But one of the main ways in which attempts have been made to destroy evidence is to destroy communication. And here we've seen this extraordinary program of murder of journalists, that more journalists have been, firstly, international journalists are not allowed in to gather information. But the Palestinian journalists have been systematically targeted, systematically murdered, with specific attacks, not just as victims of general bombing, but have been specifically attacked in a program of ongoing mass murder, to the point where there are very, very few people left who are able to professionally document and provide that information to the external world. So the unhappy conclusion that we reach here is that the International Court of Justice, despite having a very clear example of genocide in front of it, despite expressing its great concern, despite specifically handing down legally binding directives, has not had any effect on reality. That the response has been one of very, very open public defiance, not just refusal to implement, but actively doing the opposite to escalate the state of genocide. And this creates then for us a fundamental problem. Is why even have a definition of genocide? Why even have these mechanisms like the International Court of Justice, if they are not able to be effective in reality? And this is one of the things we need to think about. And not only have they been ineffective, but people defending the genocide have been actively attacking them, have been actively attacking the institutions, the representatives of the institutions, trying to undermine them, withdrawing resources from them, placing sanctions on them. So the ideal that was advanced by Raphael Lemkin after witnessing this terrible horror of the Nazi Holocaust, and the expectation that the formalization, this international body with a formalized legal structure and legal capacity, seems to really not have been fulfilled in reality. And it leaves us with a very deep question is, well, what can be done? What are the alternatives for forms of action, forms of transformation to bring an end to the issue, the practice of genocide?